Welcome to the third stage where we're playing as Zack. At least I think his name is Zack. I know it starts with a Z. The beginning to Zack's stage is kind of interesting because it has two layers. We can either stand in the sewer water or above the sewer water. I really don't have a preference. I assume for most people though that it would be easier to stay on the same plane as the putties, which would be in the sewer water. There are some hazards such as spiders and debris, but they go down in one hit. And you don't ever have to come anywhere near them when you're fighting the putties. I suppose the debris does shake it up a little bit by moving toward you slowly, but you can get rid of the debris with a normal low kick and a putty that's standing in front of the debris at the same time, so the debris may as well not even be there. This screen is a little bit more interesting because you can't really jump in here, so if you're using jumps to evade or using jumps as your normal method of attack, you couldn't do it in there. But if you were using jumps as your normal method of attack, that would be very odd. Not because they don't work, but because they take so much longer than just actually punching them with your normal punch combo. Now it's time to get out of the sewage briefly after we take out these two putties. And here's a new hazard. These little spike drill things will fall from the ceiling as soon as we run past them, but they fall on a slight delay, which means if we immediately turn around after we trigger them, we're still liable to run into them. The slight delay before they fall also means it's possible to intentionally trigger them in a way that they would hit the putties, but that seems to be more trouble than it's worth. And my personal favorite method of dealing with them is just to throw the putties directly into them, like this. Gets them out of the way a lot quicker, you don't have to worry about where you step, and you deal some damage to the putties in the process. These last few screens have had kind of interesting changes in elevation, but this next screen that we're about to run onto doesn't make much sense to me. Giving the putties the high ground doesn't really benefit them in any way, because even when they duck, they still can't hit you. It's more beneficial for you to have the high ground, not as beneficial as you might think, but for the putties it's not beneficial at all. Putties work best when they have the low ground, because even their low attack is kinda high. Right after we transform, we're met with an onslaught of normal purple putties. No other colors or anything to mix it up here, just a whole bunch of purple ones. Very easily dispatched just by mashing the attack button. After we take care of this mostly harmless purple putty and his buddies, we've got a bunch of crawling, jumping, and even some swimming to do in this level, which all makes for some very mildly interesting level design. But this level does have my favorite enemy type, this guy, who slowly crawls toward us with this wall of spikes. We can kill him if we want, but there's really no reason to do that because he stops as soon as we're done crawling. There are these nozzles that shoot purple smoke that we could easily get knocked over by if we were just running ahead recklessly. It's a shame they never combined the purple smoke with these guys with the spike walls, because that might actually add some tension and immediacy to the situation. But since they're content to keep the hazards separate, you can just take your sweet time. I mean, it's not like the guys with the spikes are moving all that fast, is it? On this screen, the putties actually spawn close enough that I got hit by one of them. This really only happens when they spawn on either side of you, though. If I would have moved to one side or the other, this probably wouldn't have happened. So I'm going to learn my lesson, and when the floor breaks right here, we're going to move over to the left. So that way when we do land, all the putties will be on a single side. We can't attack them, of course, until the water lowers, but they can't attack us either, as you're seeing here. The water is kind of neat, makes you a little worried at first because you wonder how you're going to stop the putties from hitting you while you're underwater and can't attack back. The answer is you just stay at the very bottom of the screen, though, and they can't do anything. Still, it does its job of spicing up the combat and stopping it from getting stale. It doesn't really add any difficulty to the situation, but this game isn't very difficult in general. You can consider this an introduction to the water though, because even though it's over now, we'll be seeing more of it later. And now it's time for a whole lot of wall jumping, the most wall jumping you'll ever do in the game, in fact. And depending on where exactly on the wall you jump, you may or may not end up in a beneficial situation. You do actually need a decent sense of timing to make it past the nozzles without getting knocked down and having to start wall jumping again. Fortunately, the nozzles deal so little damage that you would get a lot of tries even if you did actually goof up. And I like this level's trend of placing hazards in really obvious places that you could easily run into if you were just dashing ahead. I mean, that's not saying much because they are in really obvious places, but I like that about them. Okay, so I told you the swimming would be back, and here it is in the next room. It also combines with some maze-like aspects, which makes it even more interesting, especially since the hazards themselves are very easy to avoid. Your hitbox while swimming is massively balanced in your favor, presumably because the hitbox would be so large if it were the actual size of the Power Ranger. After you find your way through the maze, there is a bit of waiting that needs to be done so the water can actually rise up high enough for you to reach the next platform, but finding your way through the maze is the fun part. It's not even a particularly, mazy maze. You just have to find your way from left to right, and there are a couple of dead ends, but it shouldn't take more than a minute. These next two screens have some more oddly elevated platforms, and I actually like these because they go up and down enough and the putties jump enough that it's not as weird as that one time the putties had the high ground. And you can see what I mean here by us having the high ground being advantageous in some situations. I'm sure I don't need to tell you why. Just look at the screen, it's pretty obvious. Now, if the putties were smart enough to actually stop and try and attack us without jumping, that might yield better results. And we're back in the water again for the final section before the boss battle. There are more hazards in the water, and the maze is more mazy, but it still shouldn't take very long to get through. There's also an extra extra power-up in here that would give us another screen-clearing attack right there if we bothered to go for it, but we don't need it because we already have our one screen-clearing attack slot filled up. The way to get to the end through this maze is simply to take the upper path all the time and move over everything. The lower path is not your friend. It leads to so many dead ends, and by so many, I mean like 2. Welcome to Guy, my least favorite boss in the game, and because he's my least favorite boss, we're just gonna completely tank him. Sure, it's true there is a way to beat this guy properly without getting hit, but I don't feel like doing that. We're just gonna duck down all the time and smack him as much as possible. If you were interested in doing this the right way, he's most vulnerable after he finishes his attacks, but only very briefly. It's beneficial to move away immediately after you finish a combo on him. It's just really difficult for me to be asked to play it safe on a boss I don't really like when it would take so much longer than just doing it this way. I do actually really like the next two bosses, so I intend to fight those without even using the screen-clearing attack once. He has a second form where he turns into just a single floating eye, similar to Bones' third form, where he's just a floating head. Just like Bones, he fires a single projectile. It's easy to evade, but again, I can't at all be asked. Theoretically, if you did want to evade it, you would stay mostly underneath the eyeball and run left or right when it starts firing. Like that. But yeah, if it upset you how lazy I was with this boss fight, I assure you the next two will not only be really fun to play for me, but really fun for you to watch. I just have an irrational hatred of Guy and I can't be bothered.